More people than ever are trying their first cruise, and if you're one of them, there are some things that are just so important for you to think about in order to ensure that you have the best experience possible. In this video, I'm sharing with you 15 of my top tips for first-time cruisers. Some of these tips come from mistakes that I see first-time cruisers making over and over again, while others come from the mistakes that I made as a first-time cruiser, and also some of the things that I wish I knew before I took my first ever cruise. If you're new here and you've just found me today for the first time, then welcome. I'm Fraser. I've taken more than 50 cruises, and I use my YouTube channel to share my cruise experiences, all of my tips, and my advice with you to hopefully help you to have the best cruise possible when it comes around. If you like the sound of that, then please do support my channel by clicking both the thumbs up and the subscribe buttons. Now let's move in to the first of 15 things that all first-time cruisers have to think about before they book their cruise, and that is to think very carefully about which cruise line and which cruise ship they're going to cruise on. I'm such a huge believer in the fact that there is a cruise line out there for everybody, but not all cruise lines are for everyone. That's exactly the same when it comes to cruise ships, and that there are cruise ships out there that aren't for everyone, but everybody will be able to find one that suits them. Let's start by looking specifically at cruise lines. Some cruise lines operate a relatively traditional cruise product. If you look at lines like Cunard Line, for example, they operate a relatively small fleet of ships: Queen Elizabeth, Queen Victoria, Queen Mary II, and, at the point of recording this video, Queen Anne. Those ships will offer you a really traditional, quite British experience, and it's also quite a formal cruise product. If you flip that to the other end of the spectrum and you look at a cruise line like Norwegian Cruise Line, they operate a much larger fleet. They have mega ships, they have smaller ships, but they operate with what's called a freestyle cruising mentality, which means that you can essentially dress up if you want, when you want, and if you don't want to, you don't have to. There are no set dining times in terms of you need to go for dinner at 8 p.m. You can simply show up to a restaurant whenever you're hungry, and you can look forward to your breakfast, your lunch, or your dinner much more on your schedule. Now, that's two examples of cruise lines which are very, very different. So you, first of all, as a first-time cruiser, need to sit down and think, what do you want to get out of this cruise? What are you hoping to achieve, and what are you hoping to experience? Because if you want small ship traditional cruising and you book a cruise on Symphony of the Seas from Royal Caribbean, then you're probably going to be quite disappointed. On the other hand, if you want a mega ship that's got drop slides and water parks and everything else that comes with it, you'll probably be disappointed booking onto a Cunard ship. So you have to understand what you want to get out of your cruise. The next thing that you need to think about on this whole line and ship consideration is that the ships within a cruise line's fleet can be very, very different. If you look at the example of Cunard Line, since we're on that topic, Cunard operate some very traditional ships. If you look at Queen Elizabeth, for example, she is very, very traditional on board. They've recently launched Queen Anne, which is a much bigger, much glitzier, and some would argue a very different cruise product. If you look at Royal Caribbean as well, they operate huge Oasis-class, Icon-class cruise ships, but they also operate some much older, much smaller, and much more traditional feeling ships. So you really need to understand what it is you're looking for. Do your homework to find, I would suggest, first of all, the cruise line that you like the look of, and then go into the fleet and do some research to find the perfect ship. Second, choose the length of cruise very carefully when it comes to your first couple of cruises. I didn't realise this to begin with, but the length of cruise can massively impact the demographic on board. Typically speaking, longer cruises will attract a higher average age, for the simple reason that younger people who are still of working age might not be able to take 21 or 28 days off of work at one time. You'll find that demographic much more prevalent on a 7-night cruise or a 9-night cruise rather than the much, much longer options. If you look at the very short cruises that typically last 3 or 4 nights, the demographic changes again, because you'll typically find that those ships are really high with drinks package sales, and they will feel much more like a party ship than what a 7-night cruise will. So just make sure that you look for cruises that fit the vibe that you want to get on board. The other reason why you need to think very carefully about the length of cruise is that if you're a first-time cruiser, you probably want to get onto a cruise ship for a normal length of cruise before you book an extended trip. I recently met someone who had booked an 80-day trip, having never been on a cruise ship before. That, to me, is far too big a gamble. It will be great for that person and they will get to see a lot of the world in that 80 days, but there is no chance that I would do something like that having never set foot on a cruise ship before. I would always advise, try a 7-night cruise, and if worst case scenario, you really don't like the experience or you really don't perform well being on a boat or a ship, then that's okay, because you've only got 6 days left. Then you've only got 5 days left. You've only got 4 days left, and so on. And yeah, long story short, 7-day cruises are pretty good because before you know it, it's time to go home. Let's move on to number 3. Third, think very carefully about the grade of cabin that you want to book for your cruise. People used to tell me when I started cruising that I wouldn't spend much time in the cabin and I'd only really be in there to shower and to sleep. For my first few cruises, I probably would have agreed with them, to be honest, but the more that I've started to go on the ships, the more time that I am finding that I'm spending in the room. I've spoken to people over the last few years who have booked an inside cabin, they've got into the cabin and they're surprised that it feels quite claustrophobic. I've also spoken to people who thought their balcony would be much bigger and they're really unhappy with how small it is. I've even spoken to people who were really disappointed that they couldn't open the window on their ocean view cabin because the whole reason they booked that ocean view cabin was to get some fresh air in. Now, as you take a couple more cruises, you realise that all of these things are a bit obvious, but I guess if you've never taken a cruise before, you might not realise the fact that that window just doesn't open. What I always say to people when they're considering booking a specific grade of cabin, in other words, an inside cabin, an outside cabin, a balcony cabin or a suite, I always recommend them to go on YouTube, type in the ship that you're looking at, plus inside cabin or ocean view cabin, so on and so forth, and there will, I can almost guarantee you, be a number of cabin or stateroom tours on YouTube that will actually walk you around the exact grade of cabin that you're looking to book. And that way, there are just no surprises. But it's really important you think carefully about what grade you want to book for your cruise. Number 4. On the subject of cabins, think very carefully about not just the grade of cabin, but where on the ship you want that cabin to be. When you book a cruise, there are typically 2 approaches to choosing a cabin. The first approach is that you can do what I tend to do most of the time, which is book a generic grade. So I book an inside cabin, for example, and I then leave the cruise line to assign me to a cabin somewhere on the ship. The other approach that you can take is to pay a little bit extra to choose the exact cabin that you want to stay in. Now, I'm happy having my room allocated to me for a number of reasons, one of them being that I want to experience so many different types and locations of cabin because I want to tell everyone here on YouTube about the good, the bad and the ugly, to be honest. However, if you've never been on a cruise ship before, you'll want to think really carefully about perhaps booking a cabin in the middle of the ship on a lower floor, because there you'll typically experience less motion. I have actually created a YouTube video on this exact topic. I won't go into this in any more detail now because I could talk for 40 minutes on this subject, but we don't have time for that. But if you'd like to head over and watch that video, just jump down to the description of this video at the end and you'll find the link there. 5th, add any experiences or packages to your cruise way before you go to the port. Once you're booked, you'll get a booking reference or a confirmation code, and that then allows you to log into your online account. Once you've logged in, you can add things like drinks packages, Wi-Fi packages, sometimes photo packages, shore excursions. You can also book restaurants on board if you're looking for speciality dining, for example. Now, why should you book this before you go to the ship? Because wouldn't it be easier to just do it when you're already on your holiday or your vacation? Well, to be honest, the biggest reason is that you can usually save a good bit of money by going into your account and adding it before you head to the port. Now, if you're looking at booking drinks packages, for example, you'll often find you can save up to 20, sometimes 30% by booking online in advance. If you're booking specialty dining, you can sometimes save 10 or 15%. But the big benefit here is that if you're looking at booking restaurants or shore excursions in particular, you can secure the best availability by booking in advance of the cruise. If you wait until you get on board, then you're unfortunately victim to everybody else who's booked before the cruise. And if you want to get a table at that steakhouse on the sea day, well, there's a pretty high chance that all those tables will be gone. On the same logic, if you're looking at shore excursions, if there are high demand excursions that take you to very famous places when you go ashore, then they're going to book up fast. And sometimes I've seen almost every shore excursion be fully booked before I get on the ship. So yes, make sure you log into your online account and add anything that you're going to do or use on the ship before you go on holiday. Number 6, the next tip that I would always offer to first-time cruisers is that you don't have to book expensive cruise line excursions in order to experience the port that you're visiting. I meet so many people who tell me, look, I wouldn't go a cruise because I've heard that when you get to port, it's really expensive to leave the ship. But that's absolutely not the case. When the ship docks, there will be 2 options for you going ashore. Option 1 is to take a cruise line organised tour. They will then usually put you on a bus at the end of the gangway, they'll take you on a tour and they'll bring you back. Option number 2 is that you simply walk through the terminal building out into the port or into the city, and that day is then yours to do exactly what you want. Now, if you do want to take part in an excursion or a tour, but you don't want to do it with the cruise line, then you can use third-party providers. One that I use is called Viator, and I actually have an affiliate partnership with this company. They offer excursions and tours all around the world. You'll usually find that if your cruise ship is docking in a port, then Viator will service that port. I've used them on many Barcelona trips. I've also used them over in the Greek islands for walking tours and also food tours. I just think they are fantastic. And to be honest, you save an absolute fortune versus the cruise line. Now, obviously, be very careful, because if you book an independent provider rather than the cruise line, then you are responsible for getting back to the ship on time. If you book with the cruise line, then the ship will wait for you coming back. But usually it's not a problem, because the ship will dock at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. It will leave at 5 p.m, 6 p.m, sometimes even later, and you're only going to be booking an experience or a tour that lasts a couple of hours somewhere in the middle. So I would always say, if you've got a good amount of time in port, you should be looking at third-party providers to offer you a very similar, if not the same experience as what you'll get from the cruise line, but at a heavily discounted rate. Number 7. If you've never taken a cruise before, you're probably looking at cruise search engine websites, scanning down the list at itineraries that just seem to go on forever and ever and ever. And you're probably asking yourself the question, how do I know which itinerary to book? Well, in short, it's really important that you choose a cruise itinerary that is going to offer you and it's going to deliver you what you want to get out of your vacation. For example, if you want to go on a relaxing cruise where you can go to the beach almost every day, then you'll want to choose things like a Mediterranean cruise very carefully, because typically on those routes, the ship will call into big city after big city. And if you want to go to the beach, well, you're going to have to get off the ship and then travel out of the city to find a beach. If you are very beach orientated, then you might think that you want to go to the Caribbean. That might be much better suited for you. And if you're from the UK, you might be looking at things like fly cruises to get you to the Caribbean, where it will be much beachier. Now, it's entirely up to you, because if you live in the US and you want a cruise that goes to cities, then you're probably going to want to come over to this side of the Atlantic, because a Caribbean cruise will very rarely offer you big city after big city. So it's personal preference, but look at the itinerary list. Jump on YouTube or jump on Google and just search for the port. See what it's like. Does it have beaches around it? Does it have a city around it? And you'll be able to make a call about what you can expect when you get there. Number 8. Take motion sickness medication with you. I won't dwell on this for too long, but if you've never taken a cruise before, you don't know how you're going to react when you get on board. I was totally fine until, I think, cruise 47 or something, when I got struck really badly on a day at sea. All I had to do was go into my bag and take a few motion sickness tablets, and I was then absolutely fine. But as I always say, you're better to have and not need than to need and not have. Number 9, and this might be one that you've never heard before, but if you've never taken a cruise before, then take an analog watch with you rather than, or in addition to, your digital one. Now, why would you need to take an analog watch on your cruise? Well, what you'll often find is that throughout your cruise, the time zone will change, because as you cruise from the UK over to mainland Europe, the clocks might go forward for an hour, or as you leave New York City to head south to the Caribbean, you might find that the clocks there will change, or if you're crossing the Atlantic, the clocks might even change every single day until you arrive to where you're going. If you've got a digital watch, or if you're relying on the time on your phone, if that digital device crosses over a time zone and it automatically changes, you then find yourself in this really annoying scenario where you're not actually too sure what time it is. On cruise ships, there are vast schedules of events and activities, and what you don't want is to either be an hour early or worse, an hour late for everything on board, because you're going to miss so much. If you've got an analog watch, you know that you have either wound that back or wound that forward to meet the new time zone. And that means that you're always going to have the right time either on your wrist or right in your pocket. Number 10, plan before you go on your cruise what you actually want to do when you're on the ship. I meet so many first-time cruisers who walk onto a cruise ship and they are just so overwhelmed because this ship is enormous. There are 24 bars, 11 restaurants, there's a water park, there's a surfing simulator, there's 4 cinema screens, there's everything on there. And they find themselves at a bar with a drink, looking at a map of the ship, thinking, oh my goodness, how am I going to see this thing in 7 nights? With a little bit of research and a little bit of planning before the cruise, you can very easily decide what you do and don't want to do, and that then makes it significantly less stressful when you're on the ship. If nothing else, I am such a big believer in trying new things when you're on these ships, and some of them are just so big that you will never find all of the facilities within a week if you're just relying on seeing them as you walk to and from the dining room, for example. So jump on YouTube, watch a ship tour, go on the cruise line website, download a deck plan, and you can use these things to very quickly see what you do and don't want to try when you're on your cruise. But yes, spend a little bit of time planning what you want to do on board the ship, and not just what you want to do when you're off the ship in port. My 11th tip for first-time cruisers is to think very carefully about the real cost of being connected while you're at sea. This one did catch me off guard when I started cruising, and even now I meet people out on ships who are really surprised at the cost of Wi-Fi. I really, perhaps naively, assumed when I started cruising that ship Wi-Fi would operate similar to hotel Wi-Fi when I stay at a hotel on land. I thought I would get on the ship, I'd be given my login details, and then I'd have a connection. I did think that the connection would be slower because the ship was out at sea, but I didn't think that people would be on that cruise ship in this day and age with no connection to the internet. The thought of that actually made me sort of freak out a little, because I thought, oh, what would it be like if I suddenly went from this world where we're connected all the time to this other world where I can't just go on Facebook and I can't just WhatsApp people? But the more cruises that I've taken, the more warm to that concept I am. Now, how much does Wi-Fi cost? Well, some cruise lines, you'll find Wi-Fi costing about $20 per day, but that sort of package would be pretty good value. I've been on ships very recently that have cost $40 US per day to be connected to the internet, and that is an available price if you book a package for every day of the cruise. If you didn't book that package, it was even more expensive. Now, cruise ship Wi-Fi over the last few years has got better and better with the introduction of things like Starlink. It's really improved the connection and the speed that you're able to get on these ships, but it's still very, very expensive. So think carefully about the cost of being connected or the cost of being disconnected, because you might want to consider a few days of no internet, because it might even put a couple of £100 or dollars back into your pocket. Number 12. We're staying on the topic of devices. The 12th tip I would offer any first-time cruiser is to make sure that you put your phone into airplane mode as soon as the ship leaves the port. This is so important because once that ship gets a little bit off the shore, the land-based mobile or cell phone signals will drop. That means that your ship will then move into an area that will begin to pick up cellular at sea mobile networks. Now, these are designed primarily for the shipping industry or for emergency use. They're absolutely not designed for someone like me to be scrolling through Instagram, or for my phone to be sitting in my cabin constantly fetching emails because I've set it up to do that automatically. Now, with that in mind, that means that it's a very, very expensive network to be on. I've heard horror stories of people arriving back from cruise ships and they have got a bill of thousands of dollars that they then need to pay, all because they left their phone downloading something in the cabin and they just didn't realise that that cellular at sea network was so expensive. So look, better safe than sorry. Take your phone, put it in airplane mode, and then you know for a fact you're not going to get any hidden or extra charges when you get home. Number 13, don't assume that because you're taking a cruise from the US or from the UK, you don't need any additional documentation. You always have to look at what documents do you need to get into the country the ship's leaving from, and then also what documents do you need to get into any of the places that that ship is docking during the cruise. If you don't have the right documents, well, it's simple. You'll probably be turned back from getting on the ship. Your best case scenario is that you won't be allowed to disembark the ship at whatever port you don't have a visa for, but I've seen it in the past where people haven't been allowed to get on board on day one. That specific example was on a cruise I took from Dubai, and we were cruising around the Middle East to bring the ship through the Suez Canal and into Europe. When you got to ports like Oman or Saudi Arabia, it started to get a little woolly with what visas, what documents do we actually need to get into these places. And I did see a couple at the terminal in Dubai who were being denied boarding because they didn't have whatever document they needed to get into whatever place we were going to. So you can usually do this research pretty easily. All you have to do is go on the government website for whatever countries that ship is visiting, and that will tell you pretty quickly what you need if you're coming from country 1, country 2, or country 3. But a little bit of research on that front before your cruise could save you the absolute embarrassment of being turned away at the port. Number 14, look at the cruise lines that you are comparing when you're looking to book your cruise and understand what's actually included. That might help you understand why the prices vary massively across the cruise industry. Sure, there is a huge difference between mainstream lines and luxury lines, but when you're looking at mainstream cruise products and suddenly you've got one that's £700 a week more expensive for a very similar cruise itinerary, it can be baffling. It's only when you drill into it in more detail that you realise that one cruise line is offering you things like shore excursion credits, it's offering you some bar tab to spend on drinks. They maybe offer unlimited soft drinks free of charge on the ships. There are so many different things that are included on some cruise lines that are not included on others. So don't worry when you're looking at your search engines and you're seeing the prices varying by thousands of pounds in some cases. There's usually a pretty good explanation for it, and all you have to do is jump on your cruise line website and find out what's included in their onboard experience. Before we cover number 15, if you've enjoyed this video so far, then please do support my channel by clicking both the thumbs up and the subscribe buttons, and let me know down in the comments which of these tips has been most useful for you. Now, number 15 is arguably one of the most important ones on this entire list for first-time cruisers, and that is that you really need to spend time understanding the hidden costs of cruising, because so many people don't know what is going to cost them extra money when they get on board the ship. Now, I'm not talking about things like shore excursions or things like drinks packages. I'm talking about things like gratuities or tips that you'll be expected to pay per night when you get on board. I'm also talking about a service charge that will be applied to most things that you buy on board. Lots of people don't realise that if you go for example, a spa treatment, you'll then have to spend 18% extra with most cruise lines just as a service charge. Now, that very quickly does add up, because if you look at the fact that if you're paying $100 for a spa treatment, that's another $18 that you have to pay in service. And that's before you've then added a gratuity or a tip onto that too. Now, that brings me really nicely onto my next video, because over in this video, I actually detail out a whole list of things that are considered to be hidden costs when it comes to taking a cruise. So hopefully you'll come over there and join me in that one. But thank you so much for watching this video today. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll hopefully see you over in this video next.